Welcome back, friends. In today's episode, I'll be sharing scary and disturbing stories about park rangers who encounter creatures in the forest. But before we begin, please subscribe, like the video, and share it with your friends and family. I'd love to hear where you're listening. Thank you all so much for your support. It means a lot to me. Now let's get started. The red pen hovered over yet another meandering paragraph, this one describing how a forest fire had destroyed the students' childhood home, forcing their family to start over. The essay was raw and honest, exactly what I'd asked for in my American Gothic literature and personal narrative seminar. Too honest, maybe. I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silence of my office at Northern Michigan University. Monday afternoons were always quiet on this side of campus. Most faculty cleared out after their morning classes, but I preferred grading when the hallways emptied. The students' descriptions of smoke and flames, of cherished objects turned to ash, pulled at something inside me. Not the fire, we'd never had one at our cabin, but the loss. The sudden total change. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock, for 18 p.m. The wind shook the window behind me, bringing the first bite of winter. November in Marquette brought early darkness and memories I'd spent decades trying to outrun. My phone buzzed. A text from the department chair about tomorrow's faculty meeting. I replied with a quick confirmation, then returned to the essays. But the students' words had done their work. Cracking open a door I usually kept firmly shut. At 38, I'd made a life pretty different from my childhood. Professor Thomas Wilson had little in common with 10-year-old Tommy, who grew up in that small cabin 8 miles outside Marquette. My colleagues knew me as careful, quiet, which helped me get my tenure-track job. What they didn't know was where those traits came from. Growing up in the early 90s meant isolation for a kid in the Upper Peninsula. Our cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, with pines and hardwoods all around. No neighbors, no cable TV, no distractions from my father's version of building character. Robert Wilson believed boys became men through calluses and sweat. By age 7, I had daily chores that would have seemed excessive even to other rural families. By 8, I could split logs with an axe. By 9, I tracked deer through fresh snow and helped butcher what we brought home. These weren't options or games. They were expectations. A Wilson pulls his weight, my father would say. His face weathered even then, eyes constantly scanning the tree line as though looking for something. I never questioned why he was always watching the woods. That came later. The memories came back as I looked at the ungraded essay. My 10th birthday didn't have a cake or presents wrapped in colorful paper. Instead, my father gave me a .22 rifle, putting it in my hands like it was a really important moment. A gun makes you a provider, not a hero, he'd said, his calloused hand heavy on my shoulder. You respect what it does. You honor what it takes. My mother, Sarah, had watched from the doorway. She never contradicted my father, at least not in front of me. But that night she'd slipped into my room with a small wrapped package, a compass with my initials engraved on the back. "So you always find your way home," she'd whispered. The contradiction of my parents shaped me more than either probably realized. Father with his strict expectations, mother with her quiet acts of kindness. But neither was my true companion during those isolated years. That role belonged to Bandit. The memory of him made me push away from my desk. I walked to the window watching students hurry across the quad, heads down against the wind. Bandit had been an Airedale Terrier with wiry fur and tons of energy. Dad had brought him home as a puppy when I was 8. Not as a pet, but as a working dog. But from the first night, when he'd snuck into my bed and curled against my chest, he was mine. If I closed my eyes, I could still feel his coarse fur against my fingers. Still hear his excited bark when I returned from school. He'd follow me everywhere, chopping wood, checking traps, exploring the streams and ridges near our property. He slept at the foot of my bed every night for 2 years. The wind picked up outside my office window, blowing dead leaves around. Fall. It always brought the memories back more clearly, especially thoughts of that particular autumn. 1995, the fall everything changed. Thanksgiving approached, and with it the annual family gathering. Uncles, aunts, and cousins would come to my grandfather's bigger property, 20 miles deeper into the woods. That year, my father decided I was old enough for a special responsibility. "Time you showed everyone what you're made of," he said one evening in early November. The fire crackled in the wood stove as he reached behind his chair and pulled out his most prized possession, the Winchester that had belonged to his father. He rarely let anyone touch it, this relic from a harder time. "You're going to provide the main course this year," he continued, holding the rifle with reverence before extending it toward me. "Bring back something that'll make everyone proud." My mother looked up from her mending. Concern flashed across her face before she smoothed it away. "He's ready, Robert." My father nodded once, firmly. "He's a Wilson." I took the Winchester, surprised by its weight, by the worn smoothness of the wood stock that had been handled by generations before me. Pride filled my chest, along with a flutter of nervousness. This wasn't the .22 I'd been practicing with. This was the real thing. A man's gun. "Don't let me down," my father said, his eyes holding mine. There was something else there, too. Something I couldn't name then. Worry? Fear? Whatever it was, it vanished quickly behind his usual stern expression. "I won't," I promised. The next morning would be my first solo hunt with the Winchester. Bandit would accompany me, of course. He always did. I went to bed that night filled with anticipation, visualizing the perfect shot, imagining the approval on my father's face when I returned successful. I didn't know then that I'd return changed, that we all would. I turned from the window in my university office. 28 years later, and sometimes I still felt just like that same kid. I woke before my alarm, too excited to sleep any longer. My grandfather's Winchester leaned against my bedroom wall where I'd propped it the night before. Bandit sensed my excitement, his tail thumping against the floor as I dressed in layers for the November chill. The kitchen light glowed yellow as I moved quietly, fixing myself a quick breakfast. Mom had left a thermos of hot chocolate and a wrapped sandwich on the counter with a note, "Good luck, Tommy, be careful." Dad was already outside checking the truck before heading to his construction job. He stopped me at the door, giving me a long look. "Remember what I taught you?" he said, adjusting the collar of my jacket. "One clean shot. Make it count." "I will. Bandit stays with you at all times," he added, an unusual hint of concern in his voice. "Back before dark, no exceptions." I nodded, picking up the Winchester like I'd done many times before. It was heavier than my .22. Bandit walked around my legs, eager to get going. Dad got in his truck but rolled down the window. "A Wilson provides," he called out. Our family motto almost. "A Wilson provides," I repeated, standing straighter. The forest welcomed us as the first light spread through the trees. Frost crunched under my boots and my breath clouded in front of my face. November in the Upper Peninsula meant serious cold, but I hardly noticed it. This hunt mattered. My first real chance to prove myself to Dad. To the whole family. Bandit trotted ahead, nose to the ground, perfectly in his element. We trained together for smaller game, but he knew this was different. I could tell by the way he moved, more focused, less playful. The woods stretched for miles in every direction. Our property connected to state forest land, creating an unbroken wilderness that made me feel tiny. Usually I felt comfortable there. I had space to breathe, to explore, to escape Dad's watchful eyes for a few hours. Today, it felt like a test. I worried the size of the forest would make it harder to succeed. I followed deer trails deeper into the trees, checking for fresh tracks, rubbed bark, or droppings. Dad had taught me to look for signs in the forest, to notice where branches were broken or leaves disturbed. The bandit ranged ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure I followed. The morning slipped away. 1 hour became 2, then 3. My shoulders ached from carrying the Winchester, and disappointment settled heavy in my stomach. Other kids got video games for their birthdays. I got the chance to freeze in the woods and fail in front of my father. By mid-morning, I was getting really frustrated and losing confidence. I'd seen nothing worth shooting, just squirrels and chickadees. Bandit seemed to pick up on my mood, staying closer, occasionally pressing his warm body against my leg. What am I going to tell Dad? I asked Bandit, scratching behind his ears, that I walked around for hours and came back empty-handed. Bandit looked up at me with those brown eyes that always seemed to understand everything. I know. Keep trying. I pushed on, moving toward the small marsh where Dad said migratory birds sometimes stopped. I pictured returning home with a Winchester in one hand and a big buck drag behind me with the other. Dad would clap me on the shoulder, maybe even smile. "That's my boy," he'd say. The fantasy kept me going as the sun climbed higher. I stepped carefully, watching where I placed each foot to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The temperature had warmed enough to melt the morning frost, making the forest floor slightly damp and quiet under my boots. Just as I considered turning back, a sound caught my attention, the unmistakable honking of geese. I looked up through gaps in the branches and saw them, a V formation passing overhead. Without thinking, I raised the Winchester, tracking the lead bird through the iron sights just as Dad had taught me. "Lead the target." His words came back to me. "They're moving faster than you think." I exhaled halfway, steadied my arms, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked against my shoulder, the report crashing through the quiet forest. One goose folded mid-flight, plummeting through the branches. I'd done it. Joy surged through me as I ran to where the bird had fallen. It was a clean kill. Through the body, not messy. Perfect. I picked up the goose, still warm, and felt a bubble of pride expand in my chest. Not a deer, but a respectable showing for Thanksgiving. Something I'd shot with Grandpa's gun. "Look, Bandit." I turned to show him, already picturing Dad's reaction. That's when I noticed the change in Bandit's posture. His body went rigid, ears forward, the fur along his spine standing on end. A low growl vibrated from his chest, a sound I'd never heard him make before. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, reaching for his collar. Before my fingers could touch him, Bandit bolted. He shot between the trees like he'd been fired from a gun himself, barking like crazy in a way that made my stomach knot up. "Bandit!" I shouted, shoving the goose into my game bag. "Bandit, come back." I took off after him. Winchester clutched in my hands, branches whipping against my face. Bandit never disobeyed, never ran off. Something was wrong. I followed his barking through a stand of pines, then across a small creek. His voice changed from alarm to something worse, pain mixed with fear. The sound pushed me faster, my chest tight with each breath. "Bandit," I called again, panic edging my voice. I pushed through the bushes into a small clearing and stopped cold. A deer was lying on its side, its legs barely moving, with its throat ripped open. Blood soaked the leaves around it and steam rose from the red puddle in the cool air. I froze for only a second before I heard something worse from my left. Bandit's whimper suddenly cut off. About 20 feet away behind a fallen log was Bandit. His body was twitching and I thought at first he was just hurt and needed help. Then I saw it. His stomach torn open, his guts spilled out onto the ground, and bent over him with its back to me, was something my brain couldn't make sense of. The thing had no hair, with sick-looking pale skin pulled tight over what looked like just bones. It made wet, slurping sounds as it ate my dog, its long fingers with way too many joints pulling at Bandit's insides. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The Winchester just hung there useless in my hands that had gone numb. Then the thing stopped. It went completely still, like a video on pause. Slowly, it turned toward me, and I saw its face. Something straight out of a nightmare. Where I should be, there were just smooth dents. Its nose was just two slits above a mouth that stretched way too wide across its face. It didn't look at me exactly. More like it pointed its face my way. Its nostrils opened wide, taking quick, shallow breaths. It tilted its head like it was listening. Right then, I realized something for sure. It couldn't see me, but it could tell I was there somehow. My movement, my smell, some sound I made. Something was giving me away. I just stood there frozen, watching this thing that killed my dog sniff the air between us. One thought kept repeating in my head, drowning out everything else. Don't move, don't move, don't move. I couldn't move. The creature kept feeding on Bandit, making what sickly sounds as it pulled at his insides. My muscles locked in place, my mind screaming to run while my body refused to obey. Every instinct told me that movement meant death. The thing paused again. Its noseless face turning slightly to the left, then right. It seemed to be listening. Testing the air. After what felt like hours, but must have been seconds, it returned to Bandit's body, tearing away chunks with those long, jointed fingers. I wanted to shoot it. The Winchester weighed heavy in my hands, a simple movement of finger on trigger all that was needed. But terror glued me in place. Convinced that any sound would bring those teeth toward my throat next. Eventually the creature straightened. It wiped its elongated hands across what passed for its mouth, smearing dark fluid across its pale skin. Then it grabbed Bandit's remains, dragging them with unnatural strength toward the denser part of the forest. The deer carcass followed, pulled by its other arm. Only when it disappeared into the trees did my body unlock. My legs buckled and I dropped to my knees. A sob built in my throat, but I swallowed it down. The thing might still hear me. I scrambled up, the Winchester slipping from my numb fingers to the forest floor. The goose I'd shot lay forgotten in my cane bag as I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face, roots tried to trip me, but nothing mattered except getting away. The forest that had been my second home became an endless maze of terror. Every shadow held danger, every sound the creature returning. I ran without direction until I spotted a familiar deer trail, then followed it blindly, stumbling and gasping. The cabin appeared ahead and my pace quickened. Tears flowed freely now, hot tracks down my cold face. I burst through the door, letting it bang against the wall. Dad jerked upright from his chair, surprise turning to confusion as he took in my appearance. I must have looked wild. Face scratched from branches, clothes dirty from falling, eyes wide with horror. Tommy? He stood, setting aside the book he'd been reading. What happened? Where's? His eyes dropped to my empty hands. Then he looked behind me like he was expecting to see what I was carrying. His face got hard. Where's the gun? I tried to speak, but only ragged breaths came out. My whole body shook. Bandit, I finally managed. He's dead. There was a thing in the woods. It killed him. Dad's expression changed, his jaw tightening. What thing? A monster, I said, the words sounding childish even to my ears. It was eating a deer. Then it got Bandit. It had no eyes, just holes and fingers with too many joints and stop. Dad raised his hand. The word cut through my rambling like a blade. Where's my father's rifle? Mom came from the kitchen then, drying her hands on a towel. Robert, what's going on? She looked at me, worry on her face. Tommy, you're shaking. He came back without the Winchester, Dad said, his voice flat. Says some monster got Bandit. I'm not lying. My voice cracked. It killed him. It tore him open and ate him right in front of me. Dad's expression changed from anger to something worse. Disappointment. Making up stories won't bring back my father's rifle. Robert, Mom said quietly, moving toward me. Look at him. Something happened. Something happened, all right. Dad grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. We're going back right now to get the truth. My stomach plunged. No, Dad, we can't go back there. It's still out there. He paused, one arm in his jacket sleeve. You left your grandfather's Winchester in the woods because you got scared. Fine, you're 10, but lying about it? He shook his head. A Wilson faces the truth. Mom placed her hand on my shoulder. Maybe you should let him calm down first, Robert. The sun sets in an hour. We go now. He held my coat out to me. Put this on. My legs barely carried me as we left the cabin. Mom watched from the door, her face tight with worry. The woods looked different now. Threatening in a way they never had before. Dad walked ahead, his back straight, shoulders set in a way that left no room for argument. The silence between us stretched. Usually Dad talked while we walked, pointing out tracks or teaching me the names of trees. Now there was nothing but the sound of our boots on fallen leaves. Dad, I tried once, I'm not making it up. We'll see. The sun was getting lower in the sky by the time we reached the clearing. I hung back, not wanting to see what might be waiting. Dad stopped abruptly. This where it happened? I nodded, unable to look. He moved forward, looking at the ground carefully. I forced myself to join him, staying close to his side. The clearing was empty. No bandit, no deer. But dark, rust-colored stains soaked the fallen leaves and moss. In places, the earth had been messed up, leaves scattered in violent patterns. Dad crouched, touching the largest blood stain with his fingertips. See? I pointed at the stains. That's bandit's blood. And over there, that's where the deer was. The thing dragged them both away. Dad stood, wiping his fingers on his pants. His face had reddened, whether from exertion or anger, I couldn't tell. Still sticking to your monster story, he walked to the fallen log and reached behind it, pulling out the Winchester. Found this, at least. He checked it over carefully, jaw tight. Then he slung it over his shoulder, looking around once more. Animals drag away carcasses all the time, he said finally. A coyote probably got your dog. Happens in these woods. It wasn't a coyote, my voice rose. I know what I saw. Where's that goose you shot? Dad asked, ignoring my outburst. You did shoot something, didn't you? I reached for my game bag, then froze. In my panic, I'd forgotten all about the goose. I dropped it when I ran. Dad's eyes narrowed. So you shot a goose, Bandit ran off, and instead of looking for him you dropped everything and ran home with a wild story about monsters? He shook his head. That's not how I raised you. I'm telling the truth. I jabbed my finger toward the blood stains. Look at all the blood. That's not from a coyote. Dad studied the ground again. His face scrunched up. For a second I thought he might believe me. Then he straightened, adjusting the Winchester on his shoulder. Let's go home before dark, he said, his voice softer but no less final. Your mother will be worried. As we turned to leave, I took one last look at the clearing. In the fading light, the blood stains looked black against the forest floor, spreading out across the ground. Somewhere in these woods, that thing was still out there. With what remained of Bandit. Dad placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, guiding me away. Now where's that goose you shot? Dad asked, squinting at the darkening forest floor. I pointed in the general direction I'd been running from. Back that way, I think. I dropped it when I heard Bandit. Dad grunted, adjusting the Winchester on his shoulder. He started walking in the direction I pointed, looking at the ground carefully. I stayed close behind him. The idea of going deeper into the forest again made my stomach twist. We're not leaving a perfectly good bird out here, he said, his voice quieter than before. And you need to learn that running away doesn't solve problems. I wanted to tell him again that I wasn't making up stories, that the bloodstains proved something had killed Bandit. But arguing with Dad never changed his mind. Instead, I followed in silence, my body stiff as we moved through the increasingly dark woods. We searched for about 10 minutes, retracing what I thought was my path. The light was fading faster now, the sun sinking behind the trees. Dad walked confidently, not showing any of the fear that still had my hands shaking. That's when I noticed the silence. The forest was always full of sounds, chickadees calling, squirrels rustling through branches, the occasional distant crow. Now, there was nothing. Just our footsteps on the damp leaves and the sound of our breathing. "Dad," I said, my voice barely audible. "What?" He didn't look up from examining the ground. "Listen." He stood up straight, turning his head a bit. I knew he heard it too. Total silence, his eyes narrowed as they looked over the trees around us. "Let's head back," I said in a please. "Not without that goose." But his voice had lost its certainty. We kept looking, Dad moving more cautiously now. I stayed within arm's reach, the back of my neck prickling. Something was watching us. I could feel it, a pressure in the air, and attention focused on our movements. "Dad." I whispered again, "We need to go." He ignored me, bending down to check a patch of disturbed leaves. The Winchester was still slung over his shoulder, not ready in his hands where it should have been. A branch snapped somewhere behind us. I grabbed Dad's sleeve, tugging hard. "Did you hear that?" "Just the wind," he said, brushing my hand away. But there was no wind. The air was still and cold around us, the trees not moving at all. Then came a sound that made me freeze, a wet, raspy breathing like someone choking. It came from behind some pine trees about 30 yards away. Dad finally stopped looking around and turned toward the noise. He stiffened up. He grabbed his Winchester off his shoulder and quickly raised it, ready to shoot. The pale thing came out from between the trees, crawling on all fours like a person, but all wrong. Its arms and legs were too long, bending in weird ways. Its skin was tight on its bones, a dirty white color as daylight was ending. When it raised its head I could see it had no eyes, just empty holes that somehow pointed right at us. I watched Dad's face change. His doubt disappeared and turned to fear as he realized I'd been telling the truth all along. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching. "Don't move," he breathed. So quietly, I barely heard him. The creature's head tilted, its nostril slits flaring as it sniffed the air. It took one jerky step forward, then another. Dad's finger moved to the trigger. "When I shoot you run," he whispered. "Straight home, don't stop. Don't look back." The gunshot blasted through the quiet forest, the sound bouncing between trees. The creature jerked when the bullet hit its shoulder, black fluid spraying from the wound, but it didn't fall. It didn't even stagger back. Instead, its mouth with no lips opened silently, showing rows of needle-thin teeth. Then it charged, running crazy fast in a scrambling way that looked completely wrong. "Run!" Dad grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. We turned and sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces. I'd never seen Dad run like that, not even when he raced me for fun. His hand gripped my upper arm so hard it hurt, but that grip saved me when my foot caught a root and I pitched forward. He hauled me upright without stopping, practically dragging me for several steps until I found my footing again. "Keep going," he shouted, risking a glance over his shoulder. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close it was. The sound of its breathing drove us forward, that terrible wet rasping growing louder when we slowed, fading slightly when we pushed harder. The tree line appeared ahead, then the clearing around our cabin. We burst from the woods, legs burning, lungs heaving. Dad pushed me ahead of him across the yard. "Inside. Now." Mom stood in the doorway, her face going pale as she saw us running. "Robert? Tommy? What?" "Inside," Dad repeated, shoving me through the door past her, then slamming it shut behind us. His hands were shaking as he slid the deadbolt into place, then reached for the box of shells on the shelf by the Robert. "What happened?" Mom asked, backing away from the door. Dad didn't answer as he broke open the Winchester, hands trembling so badly he dropped the first shell. He cursed something he never did in front of me and tried again, managing to load a fresh round. I pressed my face to the window, searching the tree line. "Is it following us?" "Get away from the window," Dad snapped, pulling me back. He took my place, peering through the glass, the Winchester ready in his hands. Dad stayed by the window all night, Winchester ready, watching the tree line. Mom tried asking questions, but his answers came in short bursts between long stretches of silence. I huddled on the couch wrapped in a blanket, too scared to go to my room alone. It was some kind of animal, Dad finally told Mom, his voice flat. Attacked bandit, came after us. What kind of animal? Mom asked. Dad's eyes never left the window. Don't know. I opened my mouth to tell her the truth, that it wasn't any animal, that it was something impossible, but Dad cut me off with a sharp look. The warning in his eyes was clear, keep quiet. We slept in the living room that night, all three of us. Dad didn't sleep at all. Every time I woke up, I found him in the same position, looking out at the darkness, the Winchester across his lap. By morning, Dad had made a list. He drove to town and came back with new deadbolts, window locks, and enough canned food to last a month. Mom watched him install everything without asking more questions. But her eyes followed him with new worry. He worked carefully, testing each lock multiple times, making sure nothing could get in. The next day he drove to Marquette again and came back with a for sale sign that he hammered into the frozen ground next to our mailbox. I watched from the window as he pulled out all his traps from the shed and loaded them into the truck. What are you doing with those? I asked when he came back inside. Selling them, he said, removing his gloves finger by finger. Not hunting anymore. Mom looked up from the potatoes she was peeling. Robert, are you sure? We need the money, was all he said. In the following days, Dad sold almost everything. His compound bow, the skinning knives, the fishing gear, even his collection of antler trophies that had hung on our walls for as long as I could remember. The only things he kept were his father's Winchester and 2 boxes of ammunition, which never moved from their spot by the front door. School started again after Thanksgiving break, but everything felt different. The other kids talked about what they got for Christmas, what they did during the snow days, which high school team won the hockey tournament. None of it mattered. While they laughed at lunch, I kept seeing bandits inside spilling onto the forest floor, kept hearing that wet breathing getting closer behind us as we ran. Mrs. Patterson called me to her desk during art time. Tommy, do you want to tell me about your drawing? I looked down at the paper where I'd drawn the thing from the woods. I tried to get it right, the pale, stretched skin, the too many joints in its fingers, the holes where I should have been. I shook my head. You've been very quiet since coming back from break, she said, tipping her head to look at my face. Is everything okay at home? I nodded, not meeting her eyes. You know you can talk to me about anything that's bothering you. I clutched my pencil tighter, pressing the tip until it broke against the paper. I'm fine. When I got home that day, Mom was on the phone, her back to me as I came through the door. Yes, Mrs. Patterson. I understand your concern. No, nothing unusual has happened at home. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of beer in front of him. He never drank before dinner. Your teacher called, he said when Mom hung up. Said you're drawing monsters. I stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Let me see your backpack. I handed it over without argument. He pulled out my folder and flipped through my schoolwork until he found the drawings. Not just today's, but others I'd made during the week when I was supposed to be working on math. 5 drawings of the creature, each one trying to capture what I'd seen. Dad's face went hard. He took the drawings to the wood stove, opened the iron door, and fed them in one by one. The paper curled and blackened in the flames. Tommy, he said, still watching the fire consume my drawings. What did you see in the woods that day? The monster, I whispered. He turned to face me. And what did I tell the police when they came looking for the Miller boy last week? That we didn't see anything unusual. That's right. Dad crouched down so we're eye to eye. Some things we keep in the family. You understand? People will think you're crazy if you talk about monsters. They'll think we're both crazy. But it was real, I said, my voice breaking. You saw it too. I know what I saw, he said quietly. And I know what happens to people who talk about things like that. His hand gripped my shoulder. We protect our own. That means we keep quiet about some things. Even if it's the truth. Especially if it's the truth. That night I heard Mom and Dad arguing in their bedroom. I crept down the hallway, sitting just outside their door where their voices carried. "We should move," Mom said, her voice pleading. "You know what you saw." "This is our home," Dad shot back. "I won't be chased off." "What about Tommy?" "He's not the same since whatever happened out there." "He'll be fine." Boys bounce back. Do they? Because you haven't been the same either, Robert. You jump at every sound. You barely sleep. You sold everything you used to love doing. I'm protecting this family by keeping us here. After what happened to Bandit, after whatever you saw in those woods, there was a long silence. When Dad spoke again, his voice was lower. "Sarah, we've put everything we have into this place. Where would we go? What would we do?" "Anywhere else," Mom said. "A place without those woods." "And live how? On what?" The argument continued, but I slipped back to my bed, pulling the blankets over my head. I knew we wouldn't move. Dad never changed his mind once it was set. Winter turned harsh after that. Snow piled against the cabin walls in deep drifts, and the wind howled around the corners at night. I used to love winter, sledding down the hill behind our house, making snow forts, tracking animal prints through fresh powder. Now I stayed inside, watching the woods through frosted windows. I only went outside when Dad made me help with chores, and even then, I never turned my back on the tree line. The snow began melting in late March. As patches of ground poked through the snow, Dad started marking off the yard with wooden stakes and string. On a Saturday morning, he woke me early. "Get dressed," he said. "We're going to town for supplies." We drove to the hardware store where Dad bought lumber, chicken wire, and metal posts. The man behind the counter raised his eyebrows at the amount. "Building a chicken coop." "A fence," Dad said, handling over cash. "Pretty extensive fencing." "What are you keeping in or out?" Dad didn't answer, just counted his change and headed for the door. Every day after school and all weekend we worked on the fence. Dad dug post holes while the ground was still partially frozen, cursing as he chipped through the hard earth. I helped carry materials and held posts while he cemented them in place. By the end of April, a 6-foot fence encircled our property, the chicken wire reinforced with wooden slats that restricted the view into the surrounding forest. Dad built a gate with a heavy chain and padlock for the driveway. One evening in May, I found Dad on the porch, smoking a cigarette, another new habit since that day in the woods. The air smelled like spring, with buds forming on the trees and the last bits of snow finally melting away. "Dad," I said, leaning against the railing beside him, "can we get another dog?" He took a long drag, the tip of his cigarette flaring orange in the dusk. "No, but I miss having a dog." "And you said a dog is good protection." "There's no replacing Bandit," he said, his voice softening for just a moment before hardening again. "And a dog wouldn't have protected you anyway, not from that thing." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging what we'd seen since that night. "Is it still out there?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice for months. Dad flicked his cigarette into the yard, watching the ember bounce and die against the damp ground. "Yes." "How do you know?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was tight. "I just know, and so do you." He was right. I'd always known deep down that the creature was still out in the woods. The fence, the locks, the Winchester by the door. None of that stuff changed what I knew was true. We were stuck with the memory of what we saw that day. The university campus disappeared in my rearview mirror as I took the highway north toward Marquette County. My colleagues had given me curious looks when I'd announced my sabbatical plans. "You never talk about your father," Dr. Ramirez had said during our department meeting, "and now you're taking a semester to care for him?" I shrugged, not knowing how to explain that some bonds weren't about liking each other. Some were about duty, history, and secrets no one else would believe. The drive took 5 hours from Northern Michigan University, though I'd only made it twice in the last 10 years. Once for Mom's funeral 6 years ago, and before that for a Christmas visit that ended with Dad and me barely talking. I passed all the usual spots, the gas station, the old paper mill, and the turn onto County Road 553 that went deeper into the woods. My car bounced over the dirt road leading to the property. My stomach tightened as trees packed in tight on both sides. I'd spent years in therapy trying to make sense of what Dad and I had seen that day in November 1995. My therapist had nodded patiently, telling me how trauma and fear can mess with what you see, especially as a kid. Sometimes I almost believed her. Almost. The cabin came into view, looking smaller than I remembered. The wooden fence Dad had built years ago was now falling apart, with whole sections drooping or completely gone. Dead leaves had piled up at the bottom, looking like nobody had raked in months. The for sale sign was gone. Dad never actually sold the place or moved away like Mom wanted. I parked next to Dad's old Ford pickup. The truck's paint had worn away to gray with rust on the wheels. When Uncle Jim called about Dad's stroke, he told me the doctors took away his driving privileges. Not that he goes anywhere, Uncle Jim had said. Barely leaves the house these days. My bags felt really heavy as I took them from the trunk. The afternoon sun was low behind the trees, but the cabin windows were dark. I stopped at the front step, key in hand. After being away so long, it felt weird to just walk in. I knocked and waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. "Dad, it's Thomas." No response. I got really nervous. Had he suffered another stroke? I twisted the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The cabin smelled musty, like old books and wood smoke. I squinted to see in the darkness. The curtains were pulled shut on every window, letting in only small bits of light. "Dad?" I called again, setting my bags down just inside the door. A figure moved in the living room. I spotted someone sitting in the old armchair that had always been Dad's spot. "You came." His voice sounded rougher than I remembered, like it was worn down by age. As my eyes got used to the darkness, I could see him better. Dad had always been big and solid, but the man in the chair looked smaller somehow, like he'd shrunk. His face had new wrinkles, deep lines around his mouth and between his eyebrows. His hair had turned completely gray. But what caught my attention most was the Winchester rifle across his lap. The same one I dropped in the forest that day. The one he'd used to shoot the creature when it attacked us. "Course I came," I said, stepping farther into the room. "Jim said you needed help after the stroke." Dad's eyes never left mine, checking me out with that uncomfortable staring thing he'd always done. His right hand sat on the Winchester stock, left hand near the trigger guard, not pointing it at me, but not relaxed either. "What's with the gun?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I set down my other bag. Dad's fingers tightened on the rifle. Something flickered in his eyes that took me back 28 years in an instant. That same look I'd seen when we burst from the woods running for our lives. "It's back," he whispered. 2 words. That was all it took for ice to fill my veins, for the nightmares to rush forward from wherever I'd locked them away. I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile, to tell me he was just testing me. But the fear in his eyes was real. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "Started 3 months ago," Dad said, his voice steadier now that he was sharing information. "First, pets disappeared from houses down the road. The Miller's German Shepherd taken right from their yard. Then the Anderson cat, 3 more after that." I stepped closer and turned on a lamp next to the couch. The bright light made Dad blink, but he kept going. Then the Miller boy went missing. Peter, 10 years old, was riding his bike on the county road. Never came home. A sick feeling hit my gut. "Could have been anything," I said, not buying it myself. "Coyotes grab pets all the time and kids run away." Dad's mouth tightened. "That what you tell yourself at night? That what you've been telling yourself for 28 years? I didn't answer. We both knew I still had nightmares about that day, about Bandit lying torn open. About running through the woods with that wet breathing getting closer behind us. "You've seen it?" I finally asked, sinking onto the couch across from him. Dad nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of his chin, by the old oak. Same as before. Same. Everything. Did you tell the police about the boy? What could I say? Dad's laugh was bitter. That I saw the same monster that killed a dog 28 years ago, that no one believed us about then? He was right. We'd never told anyone the full truth of what we saw. When the police had come around asking about the Miller boy back then, the first Peter Miller, we'd said we hadn't seen anything strange in the woods. Could be coincidence, I said weakly. You don't believe that. I didn't. The timing was too perfect. My father's stroke bringing me back just as the thing showed up again, as if it had been waiting all this time. How's your recovery going? I asked, changing the subject. Jim said it was a minor stroke. Dad waved a hand dismissively. Left side was weak for a couple weeks. Better now. He tapped the Winchester with one finger. Can still shoot straight. I looked around the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Mail was piled on the kitchen table. Dishes stacked in the sink. A single plate with leftover canned stew sat on the coffee table. When did Mom's houseplants die? I asked, noticing the row of brown, withered stems on the windowsill that had once been Mom's pride. After she did, Dad said flatly. The words hung in the air between us. 6 years, and we'd never really talked about Mom's death. I'd come for the funeral, stayed 3 days, and left. Dad hadn't called once since. I'm going to unpack, I said, standing up. Then I'll make us some dinner. Dad nodded, but his eyes looked toward the window, toward the woods past the old fence. His fingers stayed on the Winchester. I picked up my bags and went to my old bedroom. Dad had kept it mostly the same, though the posters I'd had on the walls were gone, leaving behind lighter squares of paint. My bed had fresh sheets. He must have gotten ready for me coming home even though he wasn't doing well. I sat on the edge of the bed, touching the quilt Mom had made years ago. The walls felt too close, the woods too near. We were back where we started, Dad and I, with the Winchester and the creature and the fear that lived between the trees. But this time I wasn't a child. This time, whatever was out there wouldn't find us unprepared. I spent my first full day at the cabin cleaning. Dad watched from his armchair, the Winchester never leaving his lap, as I scrubbed counters and swept floors thick with dust. The physical labor helped quiet my mind, pushing away thoughts of what might be in the woods beyond our property. You don't have to do all that, Dad said as I wiped down the refrigerator shelves. Place needs it. I dumped another container of expired food into the trash. When's the last time you went grocery shopping? He shrugged. Jim brings things sometimes. By evening, I'd made a list of supplies we needed and drove to the small general store in town. The cashier, an older woman with gray hair and a tight bun, looked me over as she rang up my items. You're Bob Wilson's boy, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am. Heard he had a stroke. How's he doing? Better. I'm staying with him for a while. She nodded, bagging my groceries quickly. Good. Man shouldn't be alone out there, especially with what's been happening. I paused. What's been happening? You haven't heard? She lowered her voice. 5 pets gone missing in the last 3 months. 2 hikers never came back from a day trip up near Hogback Mountain. And now that poor Miller boy. My stomach tightened. What happened to him? Disappeared 3 weeks ago. Was riding his bike on County Road 553. They found the bike, but no boy. She shook her head. Search parties combed those woods for 2 weeks before they called it off. His poor parents. I paid for the groceries, my mind racing. Back at the cabin, I didn't mention the conversation to Dad. He had enough to worry about. The next morning I drove into Marquette and found a copy of the local newspaper. Sure enough, there was a small article about the search for Peter Miller. Being officially suspended. 10 years old. Same age I'd been when we ran into the creature. Same name as the boy who disappeared back then. I spent the rest of the week gathering information. The library archives confirmed the pattern. The same as before. Pets disappearing first, then hikers, then a child. I checked online forums where local hunters posted. Several mentioned weird noises in the woods at night and game cameras going missing. At the diner in town, I sat alone with coffee and a sandwich, listening to the conversations around me. Two men in flannel shirts and worn caps sat at the counter, their voices carrying. Third camera this month, one was saying. Just vanishes. No tracks, nothing. You think it's kids? His companion asked. Kids don't go that deep in the woods, and they don't take just a camera and leave them out. What did you catch on the footage before it disappeared? The first man paused. Nothing clear. Just movement. And the deer all got scared at once, looking at something off camera. I noticed the pattern the same as before. The creature was setting up its territory, getting rid of anything that might take its picture. It was hunting. Dad stayed by the window most days, Winchester ready, eyes checking the tree line. I brought him food, made sure he took his medication, tried to talk to him. Sometimes he'd talk about Mom, about the years after I left for college, but mostly he watched the woods with total focus. You should go back to the university, he told me on the fifth night as I set a plate of dinner beside him. Nothing you can do here. I'm not leaving you alone. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since I'd arrived. You still see it, don't you? In your dreams. I didn't answer, which was answer enough. It marked us somehow, Dad said quietly. That day in the woods. It's been waiting. For what? For you to come back. I slept poorly that night, my dreams filled with pale limbs and wet breathing. Around 3 in the morning, a hand shook me awake. Dad stood over my bed, finger to his lips. The Winchester in his other hand. There, he whispered, pointing toward the window. I got up quietly and went to the window. The moon was bright in the yard. At first I didn't see anything except the broken fence and the dark trees beyond. Then I noticed something moving. Near the trees, something pale moved between the trunks. I stopped breathing when it came partly into the moonlight. The creature from my nightmares. Skin tight over a long body, it moved in that same weird way I remembered, like a horrible copy of how humans move, its limbs bent wrong as it crept along the edge of the woods, its head turning like it was checking out the cabin. I just stood there, my adult brain trying to make sense of what I'd seen as a kid all those years ago. It wasn't a bear standing up or a sick, hairless wolf like my therapist had tried to tell me. It wasn't anything normal. The creature stopped, lifting its face with no nose toward the air. Even from far away I could see the awful holes where eyes should have been. It seemed to be smelling the air, its head turning toward our cabin like it knew exactly where we were. For a moment I thought it looked right at our window. At me. Even though I knew it couldn't see. Then it disappeared back into the darkness between the trees. Dad's hand grabbed my shoulder. Told you, he whispered. We stayed up the rest of the night watching the woods, but the creature didn't show up again. Morning came with gray light coming through the clouds. Dad had finally fallen asleep in his chair around dawn. I made coffee and went onto the porch, looking around the yard in daylight. Nothing looked out of place until I walked to the edge of the property where the fence had completely fallen down. There, carefully arranged at the line between yard and forest, was a dead deer. Not ripped apart by normal animals, but cut open with terrible precision. The organs were gone, leaving the inside empty. The head was completely missing. I looked at the dead deer, feeling sick to my stomach. This wasn't a normal kill. This was a message. Dad came over walking slowly with his cane. He looked down at the deer remains without being surprised. It knows we're here, he said. I called the police from my cell phone, reporting what we'd found. An officer arrived an hour later and looked skeptical, especially when he saw the deer. Probably coyotes, he said, not bothering to get close. They've been bad this year. Coyotes don't do this, Dad argued. Look at how clean the cuts are. The officer shrugged. Could be someone dumped it. Poachers sometimes take just the head for antlers. It's the same thing that took Peter Miller, I said. The officer's expression hardened. Sir, we don't joke about that case. I'm not joking. There's something in these woods. It took a boy 28 years ago, too. Another Peter Miller. It's back. Thomas, Dad warned, but I couldn't stop. Check your missing persons records from 1995. Same name, same age. It's happening again. The officer took a step back. I'll file a report about the deer. Please don't move the remains. He headed back to his cruiser without another word. Dad watched him drive away. They never believe, he said quietly. We buried the deer remains ourselves. Neither of us wanting to look at them anymore. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. I tried calling the police station again, asking to speak with someone about the Miller case, but was politely dismissed. As evening approached, I made a decision. I couldn't sit and wait for the creature to come closer, to take another child, or to finally come for us. The police wouldn't help. No one would believe us without evidence. I'm going out there, I told Dad as I laced up my hiking boots. He looked up sharply. No. We need evidence. Pictures, tracks, something the police can't ignore. It'll kill you. It could have killed us both that day in the woods, but it didn't. It's been watching us for 28 years. I need to understand why. Dad stood with effort, grabbing the Winchester from where it leaned against his chair. Not alone, he said. I wanted to refuse. His stroke had left him weaker than he admitted, and his hands weren't as steady as they once were. But the determination in his eyes stopped me. This was his fight too, had been for longer than mine. We prepared carefully. I found flashlights in the kitchen drawer and checked the batteries. Dad retrieved his old hunting knife from a box in the closet, testing the edge with his thumb before handing it to me. Remember, he said as I tucked the knife into my belt. It hunts by sound and smell. It can't see you, but it knows where you are. I nodded, the weight of the knife unfamiliar against my hip. Dad checked the Winchester one last time, loading fresh shells with fingers that trembled slightly. Outside, the sun was starting to go down behind the trees. The yard was getting darker as we got ready to head into the woods together. Dusk settled over the forest as Dad and I crossed the boundary where our yard ended and the wilderness began. The broken fence posts marked a line I hadn't crossed in 28 years, not since the day when Bandit died and something inhuman chased us back to the cabin. Now I was deliberately stepping over that line, my boots crunching on fallen pine needles and twigs. Dad moved more slowly beside me. The Winchester held ready in his hands. His breathing came heavier than it once had, the exertion of walking through uneven terrain, clearly taxing him after his stroke. But his eyes remained sharp, looking over the deepening shadows between the trees with the same vigilance I remembered from childhood. Stay close, he murmured, voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves overhead. I nodded, one hand resting on the hunting knife at my belt. The metal felt cold against my fingertips. Not much against what we were tracking, but better than nothing. The forest closed around us, looking both like home and somehow strange. These were the same trees I'd played among as a child, the same paths I'd walked with Bandit at my heels. But now everything seemed dangerous, like the woods had soaked up the evil of the creature hunting here. We followed a trail through the bushes where something had passed. Broken branches hanging at weird angles, patches of moss ripped from the ground, strange marks in the soft earth that looked like footprints but were too long, with too many weirdly spaced toes. It's not hiding its tracks, I said quietly. Dad gave a single nod. Wasn't hiding 28 years ago either. The implication hung between us. The creature wanted to be followed. It was leading us somewhere. As we moved deeper into the forest, it got darker. I clicked on my flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid broadcasting our position too obviously. Dad did the same, moving his light back and forth across the ground ahead. The forest smelled exactly as I remembered, pine sap, decaying leaves, and the fresh scent of the nearby creek. Running these trails with Bandit, learning to track deer with Dad. That final hunt when everything changed. The years I'd spent in therapy trying to convince myself it had all been a childhood trauma response. A bear or wolf that fear turned into something monstrous felt hollow now. There, Dad whispered, pointing ahead with the barrel of the Winchester. About 50 yards ahead stood the huge oak tree where he'd spotted the creature 3 nights ago. Even from here, I could see it was really old, with a trunk wider than Dad and me standing side by side, its branches stretching out against the darkening sky. We moved carefully, going from tree to tree for cover. The oak tree looked even bigger up close, its bark deeply cracked with age. Dad told me to go left while he went right, both of us moving toward the tree from different sides. As I came around the huge trunk, my flashlight beam showed something that made me freeze. Fresh cuts marked the bark deep enough to show the pale wood underneath. They were in sets of 4, each mark about 2 inches wide, curving down like something had dug its claws in and pulled them down the trunk. Dad showed up on the other side, his flashlight showing similar marks on his side of the tree. Our eyes met, and I could tell he was thinking exactly what I was. "It wants us here," I said, the words barely audible. Dad nodded, raising the Winchester to his shoulder, looking at the branches overhead and the surrounding darkness. "Stay alert." I turned slowly, knife now drawn and held ready. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves, just our breathing. The attack came without warning, a rush of movement from above. A pale creature dropping from the branches super fast. Dad cried out as the creature landed on his back, knocking him to his knees. The Winchester hit the tree trunk but didn't fire. I didn't think. I reacted. 3 strides brought me to them. The creature was on top of Dad. I plunged the hunting knife into its side with all my strength. The blade sank in with surprising ease, not as tough as I expected. The creature let go of Dad right away, making a high-pitched screeching noise as it turned toward me. Black fluid oozed from the wound. It stood up straight, taller than me by at least a foot. Its face turned toward mine. Its mouth opened, showing rows of jagged teeth. Dad scrambled for the Winchester, moving slower because he was hurt. The creature took a step toward me. I backed away, knife held in front of me. The Winchester fired with a loud bang. The creature jerked backward as the shot hit its chest. It staggered, but didn't fall, and made an even louder screech. Dad loaded another round, but before he could fire again, the creature dropped to all 4s and ran away really fast, disappearing into the bushes. Black droplets marked its path. "You okay?" I gasped, helping Dad to his feet. He nodded, face pale, but determined. "We hit it. Both of us." "It's bleeding," I said, pointing to the trail of black fluid. "We can track it." Dad checked the Winchester, making sure it was still functional after being dropped. "It's wounded. That makes it more dangerous. We can't let it get away." "Not again." He met my eyes and I could see a hint of pride on his face. Then he nodded once. "Stay behind me." We followed the trail of black fluid, walking carefully through the forest as it got darker. The droplets were easy to spot, shining wet in our flashlight beams. They took us deeper into the woods, away from any trails, through clusters of young pines and around massive boulders. About 20 minutes later, the trail led to a rocky ledge partly covered by thick brush. Black fluid marked a narrow opening between 2 big rocks. Looked like the entrance to a cave. "It went in there," I whispered. Dad raised the Winchester, aiming at the dark opening. "Could be its den." The thought of entering that darkness, of cornering the wounded creature in its own territory, made my mouth go dry. But we'd come too far to turn back now. "I'll go first," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Dad shook his head. Together. We pushed aside the brush and got closer to the cave entrance. The smell hit us first. A sickly sweet smell of rot that got stronger as we got near the opening. I pulled my shirt collar over my nose, but it didn't help much with the stink. Our flashlights only lit up a few feet ahead in the dark. The cave got wider past the entrance, with the ceiling about 7 feet high. Black fluid marked the stone floor, leading deeper inside. Dad and I looked at each other. We didn't need to say anything. We came to find evidence, and it was in there. We went in slowly, moving our flashlights across the rough stone walls. The cave went back about 30 feet before ending in a round chamber. While our lights showed the space, I stopped in my tracks, feeling sick. Bones, hundreds of them. Animal and human spread across the cave floor or stacked in corners. Some were clearly fresh. Bits of flesh still stuck to them. Others were older, turned yellow with age. Skulls of deer and smaller animals mixed with what were definitely human remains. Leg bones, ribs, pieces of skulls. My God, Dad breathed beside me. In the center of the cave was what looked like a nest. A dip in the floor lined with fabric that I realized with disgust were pieces of clothing, torn shirts, pants. A child's jacket. And there, half buried among the bones and fabric, was a small sneaker, white with blue stripes, covered with dried mud. I knelt beside it, my flashlight showing writing on the rubber sole and black marker. Peter Miller. Call the police, Dad said, his voice tight. Now. I pulled out my cell phone, surprised to find I had signal this deep in the woods. As I dialed 911, Dad kept the Winchester trained on the cave entrance, his body tense. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Thomas Wilson, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm with my father, Robert Wilson. We're in the woods off County Road 553, about 2 miles east of our property. We found evidence related to the Peter Miller disappearance. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. What kind of evidence, sir? His shoe and human remains. We're in a cave. I can share my phone's location. Please do that, sir. Are you in any immediate danger? I looked at the black fluid trail leading deeper into the cave, disappearing into a crevice too small for us to follow. I don't think so. Not right now. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line. Dad and I waited in that charnel house for 45 minutes. Neither of us speaking much. Both watching the cave entrance and the small crevice where the creature had disappeared. I wondered how far that passage went, whether it connected to other caves, other hunting grounds. When we finally heard voices calling from outside, Dad lowered the Winchester. 3 officers entered the cave cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Their professional demeanor cracked as they took in the scene, the bones, the clothing. The small sneaker with Peter Miller's name. One officer, older than the others, looked at Dad with new respect. You were right, he said simply. Dad just nodded, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. The cave became a crime scene. More officers arrived than forensic technicians. Dad and I were separated, questioned thoroughly about how we'd found the cave, what we'd seen. I told them everything except the nature of the creature, saying only that we tracked an animal we believe responsible for killing deer on our property. As dawn broke, we stood outside the cave watching the activity. Evidence bags were carried out one after another. A forensic technician confirmed what we already knew. The remains included those of a child matching Peter Miller's age and build. What do you think happened to it? I asked Dad quietly as we were finally allowed to leave. He looked toward the deeper woods, his face grim. It's still out there, wounded but alive. Will it come back? Dad's hand tightened on the Winchester. Maybe, but not soon. We walked home in silence as morning light came through the trees. The forest seemed different now. Still dangerous, but no longer holding the same power over us. We had faced our terror together and survived again. At the edge of our property, Dad paused, looking back at the woods. You were right to come back, he said. I nodded, understanding what he meant. Some things couldn't be outrun or forgotten. Some things had to be faced. We crossed the broken fence line together, returning to the cabin as the sun rose fully above the trees. The isolation of Lookout Tower 7 had become my sanctuary. 3 months into my assignment at Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, I'd grown accustomed to the creaking of the wooden structure, the endless green canopy stretching in every direction, and the ritual of scanning the horizon for wisps of smoke. After my divorce, this solitude wasn't just welcome, it was necessary. I set my coffee mug on the observation desk and picked up my binoculars for the afternoon scan. The July heat made the tower hot, even with open windows. My shirt clung to my back as I methodically checked each quadrant. Section 4 clear. I muttered to myself, logging the entry in my notebook. My daily routine had become second nature. Wake at dawn, check weather conditions, log any overnight changes. Update maps, scan for signs of fire, and repeat the cycle until sunset. Occasionally I'd spot hikers on the main trail, but visitors were rare this far out. Most people who ventured into the backcountry preferred the scenic routes closer to the park entrance. The radio crackled suddenly, startling me enough that I nearly knocked over my mug. Static hissed through the speaker before a voice broke through, distorted and urgent. Alan Peterson. Grab the handset. This is Tower 7. Go ahead. Danger coming. The voice was barely audible through waves of interference. Not what seems. Repeat your message. I can't understand you. Over. More static then. They're coming. Prepare. Before dissolving into unintelligible noise. I tried several more times to re-establish contact, switching channels and adjusting the frequency, but received nothing but empty static. The transmission hadn't followed standard protocol. No identification, no proper radio etiquette. Even stranger was how the voice had known my name. Only headquarters and the other watchtowers in the network had that information. I reached for the satellite phone and dialed headquarters. Shoshone Forestry Services, a woman's voice answered. This is Alan Peterson at Tower 7. I just received an unusual radio transmission. Has anyone reported similar interference? Negative Tower 7. All stations reported normal communications at the last check-in. What kind of interference? I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. Someone called me by name, mentioned something about danger. The signal was weak and broke up. Could be someone pulled my information from the registry and decided to play a prank. I'll alert the other towers to report any unusual transmissions. Probably just some hikers who got their hands on a radio. Unless you need immediate assistance? No, I'm fine. Just checking. After hanging up, I contacted the 2 nearest towers. Both reported clear communications and no strange activity. By evening, I convinced myself it was either a misdirected transmission or someone's idea of a joke. These towers were notorious for pranks among seasonal workers trying to make their boring days more interesting. That night, sleep came fitfully. The tower creaked more than usual as though straining against a wind that wasn't there. Twice I got up to check the supports, finding nothing amiss. Around 3 a.m., I could have sworn I heard footsteps on the stairs. But when I investigated with my flashlight, the stairwell was empty. Morning light chased away the unease. I brewed coffee and settled into my chair for the day's first scan. Radio call all but forgotten. The forest looked peaceful, bathed in golden sunlight. Still, something felt off. I checked the weather reports on my computer. Clear skies predicted for the next 5 days. Yet when I looked to the northwest, dark clouds had begun gathering over the distant mountains. Weather could change quickly in these parts, but those clouds looked scary, almost unnatural in how they seemed to boil rather than drift. By midday, I tried calling headquarters for an updated forecast but found my satellite phone showed no service. I'd never lost signal before, not even during the worst storms. I tapped the device against my palm and tried again. Nothing. Great, I muttered. At least the radio still worked for emergency communications. Around 4 in the afternoon, I caught movement in my peripheral vision while scanning Sector 6. I swung my binoculars back, focusing on a small clearing about 2 miles out. A figure walked through the tall grass with purpose. This wasn't a casual hiker. They were coming straight through the dense forest rather than following any established trail. Most visitors approached from the south along the maintained path. This person was cutting directly toward my tower from the west, through terrain so rough most rangers avoided it. I tracked their progress for 20 minutes. They walked efficiently, as though they knew the landscape well. Yet something about their gait seemed off. Too fluid, maybe. Too direct. Protocol required me to assist anyone who might be in distress. Even with the strange radio call from yesterday nagging at me, I couldn't ignore potential emergency situations. It was part of my job. I gathered medical supplies, set out water bottles, and prepared the gas cot in case they needed to stay overnight. As the figure emerged from the tree line and began ascending the path to my tower, the sky darkened prematurely. The strange clouds had rolled in faster than any natural weather system I'd ever witnessed, turning late afternoon to early evening in a matter of minutes. I turned on the exterior lights, illuminating the path up to the tower. Through my binoculars, I could now make out more details. Male, average height, wearing what appeared to be hiking clothes, though they looked oddly clean for someone who'd been bushwhacking through dense forest. He carried no visible backpack or gear. My hand hovered over the radio. I should report this visitor to headquarters, but something held me back. Maybe it was the timing. Too coincidental after yesterday's warning. Maybe it was the approach. Too deliberate through impossible terrain. Or maybe it was just instinct. That prickle at the back of my neck telling me something wasn't right. I set down the binoculars and checked my hunting knife in its sheath. Then I went to the top of the stairs, watching through the window as my visitor climbed the final stretch toward Tower 7. The tower creaked again, the same unnatural sound from last night, as though responding to the approaching stranger. Night was falling rapidly around us. I took a deep breath and prepared to greet whoever, or whatever, had made such an effort to reach this isolated outpost. A fire watcher's job included helping lost hikers, but something about this visitor set my instincts on edge. 3 sharp knocks rang through the tower. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Hello there," I said, forcing a neutral tone. "You're a long way from any trail." The man stood unsteadily in the doorway. His clothes were dirty and wrinkled, but in a way that seemed deliberate rather than the result of days in the wilderness. His face was smudged with dirt, yet his skin beneath looked oddly fresh. "Got lost," he said, his voice raspy but not parched. "Been wandering for days." I stepped back, allowing him inside while keeping my distance. "Come in. You must be exhausted." The stranger stepped into the tower, moving too smoothly for someone claiming days of exposure. His eyes darted around the room, staying too long on my equipment rather than the chair or water I'd set out. "I'm Alan, the fire watcher for this sector. Let me get you some water." He nodded but said nothing. Continuing to look around the room with a creepy focus, I grabbed a bottle from my supplies and handed it to him. "Here, how long did you say you've been out there?" "4 days, maybe 5. He took the water but only wetted his lips without actually drinking. Lost track of time. I studied him more carefully. No cracked lips, no sunburn, no signs of dehydration. Even his stubble looked like a day's growth at most. "You're in pretty good shape for someone lost that long. What's your name?" He paused a beat too long. "Miller. John Miller." The way he said it sounded like a question. I gestured to the table where I'd laid out some protein bars and dried fruit. "Hungry?" "I've got some basic supplies." "Not really hungry." His attention moved to my radio equipment. "That working?" "Sometimes reception gets spotty, but it's reliable enough." I moved toward the radio, watching his reaction. "I should call this in. Let headquarters know you're safe. They can arrange transport back to civilization in the morning." His face changed quickly. No need for that." He stepped between me and the radio. "Don't want to trouble anyone. I'll be on my way at first light." "It's no trouble. It's protocol, actually." I reached past him for the radio handset. "Plus, They'll want to know how you ended up so far off trail. He didn't move, but his eyes squinted slightly. I turned on the radio anyway, and immediately harsh static filled the room. I adjusted the frequency, tried the backup channels. Nothing but white noise. Strange, I muttered. It was working earlier today. The stranger gave an odd smile. Interference, probably. Happens in these mountains. I set the handset down, not believing him for a second. Right. Well, you should rest. You can use my sleeping bag tonight. I pointed to the rolled mat I prepared near the wood stove. I'll take the chair. I'm on night watch anyway. Very kind, he said, walking around the tower's main room, touching my scanning equipment, maps, and logbooks. Fascinating job you have, all alone up here, watching for fires. It has its moments. I kept my eyes on him while checking the perimeter alarms on my control panel, all active. Were you hiking alone? Anyone else we should be looking for? No one else, he replied, picking up my binoculars and looking through them at the darkness outside. Just me out there. He put them down and looked at me. Just us up here. I felt uneasy and moved so I could reach the knife at my hip easily. How far is the next tower from here? He asked casually. About 20 miles southeast, I lied, watching his reaction. The nearest tower was actually 12 miles northeast. He nodded, seemingly accepting this. And the closed ones? I heard some were shut down after the big fire a few years back. I got worried. How would a lost hiker know about closed fire towers? I wouldn't know much about those, I said. I've only been stationed here 3 months. But you've seen the records. He asked, gesturing toward my file cabinet. The logs, the reports. You've read about Tower 12, haven't you? I kept my face blank despite feeling very alarmed. Tower 12 wasn't marked on public maps. Look, you should get some rest. We can talk more in the morning. He looked at me for several seconds before nodding. Yes, morning. Though we don't have much time. Plenty of time to sort everything out tomorrow, I said, trying to sound reassuring. I spent the next few hours pretending to work while watching him carefully. He laid on the sleeping bag but never closed his eyes. Every time I looked directly at him, he was watching me with that same creepy smile. Around 11, I announced I needed to perform the night scan. He sat up immediately. I'll just rest in here, I said, pointing to my small private quarters at the back of the tower. Get some sleep. I slipped inside, locked the door, and collapsed into my bunk. The hunting knife rested against my chest. Despite my exhaustion, I forced myself to stay awake, listening to his footsteps as he continued to pace around the main room. Eventually, the tower fell silent. My watch ticked to midnight as I struggled to stay awake. Just 5 minutes, I told myself, closing my eyes. A soft scratching sound jolted me awake. Metal against metal, the lock on my door. I grabbed my knife and moved silently to the door. Through the crack beneath, I could see a shadow moving. Something thin and metallic worked at the deadbolt. Not a key, but some improvised lockpick. I yanked the door open. The stranger stood there bent over my lock, a straightened paper clip in his hand. Behind him I could see my gun cabinet was already open. The padlock lying broken on the floor. What the hell are you doing? I held my knife ready. Instead of looking guilty or surprised, he smiled, unnaturally wide. His teeth looked too white in the dim light. You're not ready yet, but you will be, he said, his voice different now, smoother and more confident. They're coming soon. Who's coming? Who are you? I asked firmly, keeping the knife between us. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, then plunged the tower into darkness. I lunged forward, knife extended, but connected with nothing but air. The emergency lights kicked on 5 seconds later, casting a dull red glow through the tower. He was gone. Hello? I called out. Knife raised as I moved through the main room. Where did you go? The tower was empty. I checked the stairwell. The only way down from the tower, but found it deserted. The front door remained locked from the inside just as I'd left it before retiring to my quarters. I searched every corner, every possible hiding place. Nothing. The sleeping bag lay undisturbed where he pretended to rest earlier. The only evidence of his presence was the broken padlock on my gun cabinet and the bent paper clip on the floor by my quarters. I grabbed my rifle from the cabinet and checked the tower's single staircase again. There was simply nowhere he could have gone. The fall from any window would have been fatal, and I would have heard the crash if he'd attempted it. I barricaded myself in my private quarters for the remainder of the night, rifle across my lap, knife at my side. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the tower sent adrenaline surging through my veins. When morning finally arrived, I emerged cautiously. The tower remained empty. I checked the satellite phone, dead despite being fully charged the day before. I tried the radio again and got nothing but static. After securing the tower, I went down the stairs with my rifle and walked around the base. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for tracking. Yet I found no footprints leading away from the tower, only the single set of prints approaching from the west, the ones he'd made when arriving. It was like he'd disappeared completely. Back in the tower, I forced myself to eat and drink while I inspected my equipment. Nothing was missing, but several items had been moved slightly. My logbooks, maps of the region, and emergency protocols were all just slightly out of place. By mid-morning, I finally got the radio working. "Tower 7 to headquarters over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. After a long pause, a response came through. "Headquarters here." "Go ahead, Tower 7. I reported the incident, describing the stranger and his mysterious disappearance. The dispatcher sounded concerned, but skeptical. "We'll send someone out to check on you in the next day or two," she promised. "In the meantime, keep your tower secured and maintain regular radio contact." "Copy that," I replied, not mentioning that regular radio contact had been impossible just hours earlier. For the next 2 days, I maintained my duties while remaining on high alert. I kept the rifle within reach at all times, slept with my door barricaded and knife beside my pillow. Several times I thought I heard footsteps circling the tower at night, but when I checked, I found nothing. The stranger's words stuck with me. "They're coming soon." Who was coming? And how had he vanished from a tower with only one exit? As I scanned the forest on the second evening, I kept looking to the northwest, where those unnatural clouds had first appeared. Something was happening in these woods, something I couldn't explain. The warning from the radio, the visitor who vanished, they were connected somehow. I just needed to figure out how before whoever they were arrived. I kept my eyes locked on the northwestern horizon, searching for any sign of those unnatural clouds returning. Night had fallen hours ago, leaving only darkness where the boiling clouds had been. My rifle rested across my lap, loaded and ready. "They're coming soon." The stranger's words played on a loop in my mind. Who? When? And how had he vanished from a tower with only one exit? I rubbed my tired eyes and checked my watch. Past midnight, another sleepless night stretched ahead of me. 2 days passed with constant watchfulness and tiredness. I maintained my normal duties, logging reports and scanning for fires, but I just went through the motions. I was just trying to survive. I barricaded the stairwell door each night and slept with my rifle within reach, if you could call fitful dozing sleep. Headquarters had finally responded to my report about the stranger. "We'll send someone to investigate as soon as possible," the dispatcher promised, likely within the next day or two. I didn't expect much. In my 3 months as a fire watcher, I'd learned that, as soon as possible, usually meant when convenient. Being alone, which I used to enjoy, now made me feel exposed. I'd taken to carrying my hunting knife everywhere, even to the bathroom. The broken lock on my gun cabinet was a constant reminder that the stranger had been real, not some hallucination born from isolation. On the 3rd night after his disappearance, I stood at my observation window doing my evening scan. The forest looked peaceful in the fading light. Too peaceful, perhaps. I'd noticed fewer animal calls over the past days, as if the wildlife sensed something wasn't right. I swept my binoculars methodically across each section, pausing occasionally to make notes in my log. When I reached the northeastern quadrant, something caught my eye. A faint blue light pulsed in the distance, barely visible against the darkening sky. I adjusted my binoculars, focusing on the source. The light came from the direction of Tower 12, a decommissioned observation post about 15 miles away. According to my maps, that tower had been abandoned after a forest fire damaged the area 5 years ago. The light pulsed with an odd rhythm, 3 quick flashes followed by a longer pause, then repeating. Definitely not natural. Not a campfire or lightning. This was deliberate, artificial. I checked my maps again. Tower 12 hadn't been marked for official use in years. It should have no power, no personnel. According to the status reports I'd reviewed during my orientation, it was slated for demolition once the Forest Service budget allowed. So why was it lighting up like a beacon? I tried the satellite phone again, but it remained dead. Frustration built in my chest as I set it down and reached for the radio instead. Before I could transmit, the radio crackled to life on its own. Static hissed through the speaker, followed by that same distorted voice I'd heard days ago. Don't go to the tower. I snatched up the handset. Who is this? How are you accessing this frequency? Something dangerous waits there. The voice ignored my questions. They're using it as a beacon. A beacon for what? Who are you? I demanded, gripping the handset tighter. You know me better than you realize. The voice seemed closer somehow, less distorted. We don't have much time. I glanced back toward the pulsing light, then to the radio. Are you at Tower 12? Is that how you know about the light? No, stay away from there. Urgency filled the voice. Watch for imposters. They'll come wearing faces, you know. What does that mean? Imposters? Who? Static overwhelmed the transmission, cutting off any response. I tried changing frequencies, adjusting settings, even banging the unit against the desk in frustration. Nothing worked. The light continued its rhythmic pulsing across the miles of forest that separated us. 3 quick flashes, pause, repeat. Sleep wasn't an option. I pulled out the station records looking for anything related to Tower 12. Most of the files contained standard maintenance logs and weather reports, but buried in the back of the filing cabinet, I found a folder marked Incident Reports Restricted. Inside were several documents detailing strange occurrences around Tower 12 over the years. Rangers reported equipment malfunctions, compasses spinning wildly, and, most disturbing, periods of lost time while patrolling near the tower. The most recent reports concerned Douglas Finch, a fire watcher who'd been stationed in my tower before me. According to the file, Finch had begun reporting strange lights in the forest 6 months ago. His logs became increasingly erratic, filled with descriptions of patterns in the movement and communications through light. The official record attributed his behavior to psychological breakdown from prolonged isolation. After Finch failed to check in for 3 consecutive days, a search team was dispatched. They found the tower empty, his belongings still in place. Douglas Finch had simply vanished. The final page was a recommendation to close Tower 7, my tower, permanently. Someone had scrawled across it in red ink. Denied. No evidence of environmental factors. Psychological evaluation for future personnel. That explained the unusual length of my psychological screening before being assigned here. They'd been looking for someone stable, someone who wouldn't crack like Finch apparently had. I set the files aside and returned to the window. The blue light continued its steady pulse. Despite the voice's warning, I felt drawn to it. If there were answers about what was happening, they would be at Tower 12. I pulled out my topographical maps and began planning a route. The direct path would take me through some rough terrain, but I could make it in a full day's hike if I left at first light. I marked potential water sources and places to rest along the way. As I worked, a soft scraping sound came from outside. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the window. The sound circled the tower's perimeter, footsteps moving slowly, deliberately around the base of my tower. I checked the perimeter alarm panel. All indicators showed green. Nothing had triggered the sensors. The footsteps continued their circuit, unhurried. As if whoever made them knew I was listening and didn't care. They completed a full circle, paused beneath my window, then slowly moved away into the forest. I felt tense as I watched the tree line, but saw nothing move in the darkness. I returned to my maps, focusing on the task at hand while trying to ignore the coldness creeping up my spine. If I was going to investigate Tower 12, I needed to be prepared. I pulled my backpack from the storage closet and began packing essentials. Water, food, first aid supplies, compass, flashlight. After a moment's hesitation, I added extra batteries for my radio. Whatever, or whoever, was sending those transmissions seemed to know what was happening. If that voice was my only source of information, I needed to keep communication possible. As I finished my preparations, I glanced once more at the blue light pulsing in the distance. 3 flashes, pause, repeat. It could be a sign. It could be a warning. Or it could be a trap. Despite my instincts telling me to stay put, to wait for headquarters to send help, I knew I wouldn't be able to resist investigating. The stranger had disappeared completely. The voice on the radio knew my name and warned of danger. And now a decommissioned tower was sending signals across miles of wilderness. All signs pointed to Tower 12. All warnings told me to stay away. I set my alarm for dawn and tried to rest, knowing full well that sleep would be impossible with all my unanswered questions and the memory of those footsteps circling my tower. Tomorrow I would find answers, regardless of the consequences. The sound of an engine broke the morning silence, pulling me from a fitful sleep. I bolted upright, my hand instinctively reaching for the rifle I'd kept beside my bed. The sky was just turning orange and pink as I moved to the window. A Forest Service Jeep bumped along the access road, its green paint standing out against the surrounding trees. My shoulders tensed. The promised help from headquarters had arrived sooner than expected. I splashed water on my face and grabbed my jacket, not bothering to change the clothes I'd slept in. The backpack I'd prepared sat by the door, ready for my planned expedition to Tower 12. I briefly considered hiding it, then decided against it. Official rangers came through here regularly, and having hiking gear ready wouldn't seem suspicious. The Jeep parked at the base of my tower. A man in a crisp, Forest Service uniform stepped out, adjusting his hat before looking up toward my window. Something about his posture struck me as odd. Too perfect. Too deliberate. I grabbed my knife and tucked it into my belt at the small of my back, then headed down to meet him. "Alan," the ranger called out with fake friendliness as I descended the stairs. "Good to see you, buddy." I froze halfway down. His tone suggested we were old friends, but I'd never seen this man before in my life. "Morning," I responded cautiously, continuing down the stairs. "You're from headquarters?" "Kevin Hartwell," he said, extending his hand with a broad smile. "Don't tell me you've forgotten me already. We had that long chat about the fishing spots near Buffalo Creek last month when I delivered your supplies." I shook his hand, feeling the hairs on my neck rise. His grip was firm but oddly cold despite the summer heat. "Sorry, been a long few days," I said, looking at his face. "Lot on my mind." Kevin laughed, the sound too practiced. "No problem. You were pretty distracted talking about your divorce anyway. How's that going? Still getting those papers finalized?" My divorce had been finalized 2 months ago before I even took this assignment. I had mentioned it briefly during my intake interview, but nothing since. "All done now," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Come on up, I've got coffee." Kevin followed me up to the tower, his boots making precise measured sounds on each step. Inside, he walked directly to the small kitchenette and reached for the left cupboard. "You still keeping the coffee over here instead of with the other supplies?" he asked, pulling out my half-empty bag of grounds without waiting for a response. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I'd never shown anyone my personal organization system. I prefer keeping coffee separate from my emergency supplies. But wasn't something anyone would know unless they watched me. Yeah, old habits, I said, leaning against the desk while Kevin moved around my kitchen like he knew it too well. So headquarters sent you about my report, the intruder? Partly, Kevin replied, measuring coffee with military precision, but also checking in on all remote stations. Had some strange reports lately. I decided to test him. I was actually planning a hike today. Thought I'd check out Tower 12, see if there's anything to those lights I reported. The change was instant. Kevin's fluid movement stuttered. He set down the coffee scoop very slowly and turned to face me. Tower 12? His voice remained pleasant, but his eyes had hardened. That's not a good idea, Alan. That structure was condemned years ago after the fire damage, completely unsafe. I wasn't planning to climb it, I lied, just curious about the area. Kevin's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. No need for that. We're sending a specialized team later this week. He resumed making coffee. Did you know Douglas Finch was obsessed with that tower? Finch? The missing fire watcher? I asked, pretending I hadn't just read his file last night. Yes. Poor guy started showing signs of instability about 6 months into his assignment. Kevin shook his head with manufactured sympathy. Started reporting strange lights, then began lighting patterned fires himself. We think he might still be out there. You think Finch is sending the radio transmissions? I asked. Kevin nodded. Makes the most sense. He knows the frequencies, the protocols. Probably the same person who broke into your tower. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to me. That's why I want you to stay put. Let our specialized team handle it. I accepted the coffee, but didn't drink. When did you leave headquarters this morning? Around 5 a.m. Kevin answered without hesitation. Wanted to get here early. I glanced at his watch as he raised his cup. It showed 820, but my tower clock read 745. The drive from headquarters took less than 2 hours. You came through the eastern marshland, I asked. Heard the trail got flooded after the rain. It did, Kevin confirmed, taking a sip of coffee. Had to take it slow through the mud. I looked down at his boots. They had dried mud caked around the edges, but it was flaking off rather than still damp. The marshland would have left them soaking wet if he passed through this morning. Well, I appreciate you coming out, I said, setting my untouched coffee aside. Want to check my equipment while you're here? Make sure everything's functioning correctly. Good idea, Kevin replied, seemingly pleased with the suggestion. For the next hour, I watched him inspect every piece of equipment in the tower. He checked my radio, weather instruments, computer and scanning equipment with methodical precision. His knowledge of the systems was thorough. Yet something felt mechanical about his movements. Everything looks operational, he finally declared, closing the access panel on my radio. Your satellite phone giving you any more trouble? I hadn't mentioned problems with my satellite phone. Not since yesterday, I said carefully. Seems to be working now. Good, good. Kevin nodded, looking at my backpack by the door. Planning a hike despite my warning? Just standard preparedness. I replied, never know I might need to respond to an emergency in my sector. Kevin smiled, always the professional Alan, that's why they value you out here. He glanced at his watch. I should head back. I'll return tomorrow with some fresh supplies for you. That would be great, I said, walking into the door. The usual route back to headquarters. Of course, he replied smoothly, unless you recommend a scenic detour. The question felt like a test. Stick to the main route, I advised. Some of those side trails can get confusing if you don't know them well. Right you are. Kevin descended the stairs with that same measured pace. At the bottom he turned and waved. Lock up tight tonight, Alan. Don't open the door for anyone but me, understand? The command in his tone was unmistakable beneath the friendly veneer. Will do, I called back, watching as he climbed into his Jeep. I waited until the vehicle disappeared around the first bend before rushing to gather my binoculars. From my observation platform, I tracked the Jeep's progress through gaps in the trees. After about 2 miles, it should have turned southeast toward headquarters. Instead, it continued straight west toward Tower 12. I swept the tower, checking every corner and storage space, suddenly aware of what was missing. My satellite phone was gone from its charging station. Kevin had taken it, removing my only reliable communication with the outside world. I grabbed my backpack and quickly inventoried the contents. Water, protein bars, first aid kit, flashlight, spare batteries, compass, maps. I added my journal, extra ammunition for the rifle, and a small pair of binoculars. My hunting rifle came last, loaded and secured for travel. Whatever was happening, Kevin, if that was even his real name, was at the center of it. His knowledge of my personal habits, the inconsistencies in his story, and now his unauthorized detour to Tower 12 all confirmed my suspicions. The voice on the radio had warned about danger. The stranger had vanished without a trace. Now a ranger who knew too much was heading toward the mysterious tower that shouldn't have lights. I locked the tower behind me and descended the stairs, rifle in hand. Kevin had about a 30-minute head start, but he was in a vehicle restricted to roads and trails. On foot, I could take more direct routes through the forest. The weight of the pack settled against my shoulders as I set off, keeping low and using the trees for cover. I tracked Kevin at a safe distance, discover what he was doing at Tower 12, and maybe finally get some answers about what was happening in my forest. The morning sun filtered through the canopy as I moved west, following game trails and using my compass to maintain direction. Every few minutes I stopped to listen, alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. Kevin had said not to trust anyone, but the person I trusted least right now was Kevin himself. The forest thickened as I moved deeper into unknown territory. 5 miles of tracking, Kevin had led me through increasingly rough terrain. The well-marked trails had given way to dense undergrowth and steep ravines that slowed my progress. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the shade from the towering pines. I paused at a small clearing to check my compass again. Kevin's Jeep had left clear tracks on the service roads initially, but he'd eventually turned onto an unmarked path that didn't appear on any of my maps. Now I was navigating purely by intuition and occasional tire marks, where the ground was soft enough to hold an impression. The sun had passed its zenith and hung in the western sky. In a few hours, it would set, and I'd be stuck out here in the dark. My gut told me to turn back, but something about Tower 12 and its mysterious lights pulled me forward. I took a swig from my canteen and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. Something felt wrong about the forest today. The usual background noise of birds and insects had decreased the further west I traveled. Now a strange quiet surrounded me, broken only by the occasional creak of branches in the wind. My radio crackled to life without warning, making me jump. "Alan, turn back now." The same distorted voice from before cut through static. "They know you're following. They're coming for you before sunset." I fumbled for the handset, nearly dropping it in my haste. "Who is this? What do you mean they're coming?" I demanded, scanning the trees around me. No time to explain everything. The voice sounded clearer than before, almost like someone I knew. "You've been through this before. Each cycle they get closer. The note in your left boot will explain." I froze. "What note? What are you talking about?" "Check your left boot. Now." The urgency in the voice left no room for argument. I set down my pack and rifle, keeping them within reach as I unlaced my left hiking boot. The sock came off next, and I ran my fingers inside the boot, feeling along the insole. My fingertips caught on something tucked beneath the arch support, a small folded piece of paper I had no memory of placing there. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, though I had no recollection of writing it. "If you're reading this, they've already found you and reset the cycle. The Rangers aren't Rangers. Stay away from Tower 12. It's a trap. They use it to lure you in every time. Don't trust anyone with a uniform, especially Kevin. He'll seem to know your habits because he studied you through previous cycles. If you're reading this, it's already the 5th cycle. Run. I stared at the note. 5th cycle. Reset. None of it made sense, yet the handwriting was definitely mine. The distinctive way I crossed my T's and the slight leftward slant couldn't be imitated. The radio crackled again. You found it. It wasn't a question. I don't understand, I said, tucking the note into my pocket and pulling my sock and boot back on. How did this get here? I don't remember writing it. You wouldn't. They wipe your memory at the end of each cycle. The voice paused. You have to trust yourself. You left that note for yourself before the last reset. Who are they? I asked, lacing my boot with shaking fingers. The Rangers? Yes, but they're not Rangers. Not human. There's more written on the back of the note. I pulled the paper out again and flipped it over. A list of items was scrawled across the back. Rifle plus all ammo. Compass southeast sector maps. Water purification tablets. Metal box under floorboard beneath desk. Use the emergency exit when they come. I need to get back to the tower, I said, more to myself than the radio. Yes, right now. They're moving faster this cycle. You have maybe 3 hours before sunset. The voice became urgent. Get what's on that list and get out. Don't wait for them to come to you. Who are you? I demanded, shoving the note back in my pocket and gathering my gear. How do you know all this? A long pause followed before the voice responded. Softer now. I'm you, Alan, from the end of the last cycle. I don't have time to explain how this works. Just get back to the tower and find the metal box. Everything you need to understand is in there. The radio went silent. I tried calling again but received nothing but static. I turned east, my mind racing with questions as I started the long trek back to my tower. If Kevin had gone to Tower 12, I'd be moving directly away from him, which seemed like the smartest course of action given the warning. My pace quickened with each passing minute. The crowing shadows and trees seemed to reach for me as I moved. Twice I thought I heard movement parallel to my path. But when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. 2 hours of hard hiking brought me to territory I recognized. I'd made better time returning than I had setting out, driven by a growing sense of dread. As I approached the final ridge overlooking my tower, I dropped to my stomach and crawled forward. What I saw through the trees stopped my breath. 5 Forest Service jeeps were parked at the base of my tower. A group of uniformed rangers stood in a loose circle, heads bent together as if in quiet conference. Kevin stood among them, the same Kevin who should have been miles away heading toward Tower 12. I raised my binoculars for a closer look. I felt cold fear as I observed them. All 5 rangers stood with identical postures, feet planted at exactly the same width, hands clasped behind their backs in precisely the same manner. Even more disturbing, they all wore Kevin's face. 5 identical men in ranger uniforms, positioned like mannequins around my tower. As I watched, they broke their huddle with synchronized movements, spreading out to establish a perimeter around the tower. Their gaits matched perfectly. Right foot, left foot, precise and mechanical. Then, as if sensing my presence, all 5 heads turned simultaneously toward my position on the ridge. The movement was so uniform, so unnatural, that I felt deeply unsettled. 5 identical faces stared in my direction with empty expressions. I ducked below the ridge line. They couldn't have seen me from that distance, could they? I crawled backward until I was safely hidden by trees, then circled around, using the dense forest as cover. If I approached from the north instead of the east, I might reach the tower stairs without being spotted. 30 minutes of careful movement brought me to the back of the tower. I could hear voices now, all with the same timbre and cadence, all sounding like Kevin. He'll return soon. The pattern remains consistent. Prepare for extraction before darkness. The cycle nears completion. Their empty tones worried me more than any shouted threat could have. I crouched in the underbrush, watching as two of the Kevin Rangers moved toward the forest edge, sweeping the area in a search pattern. The remaining three positioned themselves around the tower's base. I needed to get inside, but they had the ground floor surrounded. My only chance was to wait for an opening and make a dash for the stairs. When one of the Rangers moved to check something in his jeep, a small gap appeared in their formation. I took my chance, sprinting from my hiding place toward the tower stairs. There! The shout came in perfect unison from all three Rangers. I took the stairs two at a time, the wood creaking beneath my pounding boots. Behind me, I heard the synchronized footfalls of multiple pursuers. At the top, I fumbled with my keys, jammed one into the lock, and threw myself inside the tower. I slammed the door shut and twisted the deadbolt just as the first Ranger reached the landing. 3 sharp knocks rattled the door, identical in rhythm and force. Alan Peterson, open the door. Kevin's voice, but flatter, emptier than before. I backed away. I forgot something, I called, hoping to buy time. Give me a minute. The cycle is ending. We must prepare you for transfer. The voice lacked any inflection. Open the door immediately. I grabbed the desk chair and wedged it under the doorknob, then piled my small bookshelf against it. It wouldn't hold them long, but I needed time to find what the note had mentioned. The floor beneath my desk. I dropped to my knees and ran my fingers along the wooden planks, searching for any sign of a loose board. Near the back corner, my fingernails caught on a seam. I pried at it, and the board lifted slightly, more pounding at the door. Final warning, Alan Peterson. Open or we will enter by force. I ignored the voice and worked my fingers into the gap, pulling upward. The board came free, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a metal ammunition box, dented and scratched, but securely latched. I pulled it out and flipped the latch. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a folded map with markings I didn't recognize. The first heavy impact hit the door, making the hinges groan. I grabbed my backpack and started filling it with the items from the list. My rifle and remaining ammunition. The compass from my desk drawer. Southeast sector maps from the filing cabinet. The water purification tablets from my emergency kit. I stuffed the journal and map from the metal box into my pack last, then slung it over my shoulders. Another crash against the door splintered the wood around the top hinge. I needed an exit strategy. The emergency exit. I'd never used it before. It was a small hatch in the floor on the opposite side of the tower, designed as a fire escape. A metal cable ran from it to the ground, allowing for a controlled slide down if the stairs were compromised. I rushed to the hatch and twisted the release mechanism. It opened with a creak of disused hinges, revealing the metal cable disappearing into the growing dusk below. The door to the tower burst inward, chair and bookshelf tumbling aside. 5 identical Rangers stood in the doorway, moving as one unit. The cycle must continue, they said in perfect unison. I didn't wait to hear more. I gripped the cable with gloved hands and dropped through the hatch, sliding down toward the forest floor as synchronized footsteps crossed the tower above me. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky blood red. The cycle, whatever it was ending. And I was running out of time. The cable burned through my gloves as I slid down from my tower, the friction heating the metal despite the cool evening air. My boots hit the ground with a heavy thud, pain shooting through my ankles at the impact. I didn't have time to recover. Above me, 5 identical faces peered down through the emergency hatch, moving in that disturbing synchronization that confirmed they weren't human. I sprinted for the treeline, the weight of my backpack bouncing against my spine. I entered the darkening forest as behind me came the sounds of pursuit, not frantic or chaotic as humans would make, but rhythmic and measured. 5 sets of boots hitting the ground in perfect unison. Alan Peterson. The cycle is incomplete. Their voices carry through the trees, a single voice multiplied by 5. My lungs burned as I pushed deeper into the forest, using the fading light to navigate between dense pines and overfallen logs. My compass pointed east, but instinct told me to head north first to throw off their pursuit before circling back toward my intended destination. The sounds of the Rangers faded briefly, then returned with unsettling persistence. They didn't tire or slow, maintaining the same mechanical pace regardless of terrain. When it became completely dark, I flicked on my flashlight just long enough to check my compass, then plunged it back into my pocket. Hours passed in a blur of desperate movement. Whenever I thought I'd lost them, their synchronized footsteps would emerge again from the darkness, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always coming. My muscles were extremely tired. My mouth parched despite rationing my water. Near midnight I paused at the edge of a small clearing to get my bearings. Moonlight illuminated the space just enough to see a ridge of rocky outcroppings to my left. I pulled out the folded map from the metal box, squinting at it in the dim light. A crude drawing showed a series of hills and a small X-marked blind spot near my current position. Beneath it, more of my own handwriting. They can't see the cave. Don't know why. Use it. I studied the rocky hillside, searching for any sign of an opening. As I approached the base of the ridge, the ranger's footsteps grew louder behind me. My flashlight beam bounced across the stone face until it caught on a narrow gap between boulders, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I shut off my light and listened. 5 sets of footsteps approached the clearing, then stopped. Their voices carried across the night air. Signal lost. The perimeter expanded. Continue eastward. He follows the established pattern. Their confidence chilled me. What pattern? How many times had I fled through these woods, thinking I was making unique choices? I squeezed between the boulders, scraping my arms and shoulders. The inside felt cooler and damp. I crawled as deep as I could, then curled against the back wall. Hardly daring to breathe as the synchronized footsteps passed directly outside. They didn't pause, didn't investigate. Continued eastward as if the cave didn't exist. I waited until their footsteps faded completely before risking my flashlight. The beam illuminated a small, unremarkable cave, except for one detail that shocked me. Scratched into the wall beside me were 5 sets of tally marks, each with 4 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal. 20 marks in total. Below them, a message. 5th cycle. Read the journal. My hand trembled as I pulled a leather-bound journal from my pack. The first page contained a list of dates, each crossed out, with my signature below them. The most recent was yesterday's date, in my handwriting, but had no memory of writing it. I turned the page and began to read. If you're reading this, I am you and you are me and we're both trapped. This is the 5th cycle that I can document. There may have been more before I started leaving myself messages. The journal detailed 4 previous cycles where I experienced similar events. The radio warning, the stranger who vanished, the rangers with identical faces. And always ending with my capture near Tower 12. Each capture somehow reset the timeline. Beginning again with that first radio call warning me about unnatural clouds. The voice on the radio is us. One entry explained. Somehow when they reset the cycle, a fragment of our consciousness exists outside their control, like a sound that can repeat backward through their experiment. Each cycle, we're able to communicate a little more clearly with our past self. I read for hours, absorbing the impossible truth. According to my own account, I've been living the same weeks over and over, with slight variations each time. The journal documented my growing understanding across cycles, how I'd gone from confused victim to active resistor, leaving myself clues and warnings. They're not human, I'd written in the 3rd cycle. They seem to be studying human response to isolation and fear. The experiment always ends at Tower 12, where they capture me and reset everything. The final entry was the most disturbing. I'm writing this as they approach the tower. 5th cycle ending. If you're reading this, we've created a fracture in their control. The metal box was never discovered in previous cycles. The cave seems to exist in their blind spot. Use these advantages. Break the loop. Reach the eastern highway before the next sunset. Their influence has boundaries. Cross it, and we might finally escape. I closed the journal, feeling shocked. Dawn light filtered through cracks in the cave entrance, marking the passage of night. I'd read until morning without realizing it. I repacked my bag, tucking the journal securely inside and squeezed back through the gap into the morning forest. Birds chirped overhead. The first natural sound I'd heard in what felt like days. After checking my compass, I circled cautiously back toward my tower. If the rangers were pursuing me eastward, the tower might be temporarily abandoned. I needed to see it one more time to validate what the journal had told me. The tower was silent in the morning light, door hanging open on broken hinges. I approached cautiously, rifle ready, but sensed no movement inside or around the structure. Climbing the stairs, I found the main room in chaos. My belongings scattered across the floor, equipment smashed beyond repair. They'd methodically destroyed everything they hadn't taken. I stood in the wreckage of my temporary home, a strange calm settling over me. If the journal was accurate, none of this was really mine. I was just passing through a scenario they'd created and reset multiple times. The radio crackled to life on its own, making me jump despite everything I'd read. "Alan, can you hear me?" My voice, my actual voice without distortion this time. I grabbed the handset. "I hear you. I found the journal." "Good. They've set up a perimeter around the forest. The road to the east is your only chance. You must reach it by nightfall or the cycle begins again. I can't help you after this transmission." "Who are they? What do they want?" I asked, desperate for answers beyond what the journal had provided. "We don't know everything. They're not from here. They're studying us. Our fear, our resistance, our adaptability. Each cycle they adjust variables, watching how we respond." The voice, my voice, paused. "You're trapped in their temporal experiment. Your repeated resistance has created a fracture in their control. That's how I can reach you across cycles. Why can't they find the cave? Why didn't they find the metal box? Their perception has limits. They focus on patterns, on what they expect to see. The box was hidden in a way that defied their pattern recognition. The cave exists in some kind of perceptual blind spot, maybe natural to this area. Maybe something about the mineral composition. All that matters is that it works." I glanced out the window toward the eastern horizon. "How far is the boundary?" "About 15 miles in a straight line. Rough terrain most of the way. They'll be searching for you, trying to herd you back toward Tower 12. The voice grew urgent. "This is my last transmission. The energy required to maintain this connection across cycles is depleting. If you fail, I won't be able to reach you again with this clarity. And if I succeed, then we break free. And maybe we can help the next person they trap." The radio crackled. "They're coming back. Move now, Alan. Eastward. Don't stop until you cross the highway." The radio stopped working with a final burst of static. This time, no amount of adjusting brought it back to life. I pocketed a few more useful supplies from the wreckage, matches, a candy bar, an extra pair of socks, and secured the journal inside my jacket. The weight of it against my chest felt heavy, but reassuring. Outside, I paused on the landing to get my bearings. The morning sun illuminated the eastern forest where my escape route supposedly was. 15 miles of unknown terrain with inhuman pursuers behind me. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood what was happening. I wasn't lost or crazy. I was trapped, but with a clear path to freedom. I took a deep breath and descended the tower stairs one last time. At the bottom I turned east, compass in hand, and began walking with purpose. The cycle had to end, the loop had to break, and I was the only one who could do it. I set a brutal pace through the eastern forest. The morning light filtering through dense foliage as I navigated by compass. My muscles protested with each step, still sore from the night's frantic escape. But I pushed forward. Freedom waited 15 miles ahead, if the journal could be trusted. The first hour passed without incident. Birds called overhead, a deceptively normal soundtrack to my desperate flight. I maintained as straight a line eastward as the terrain allowed, checking my compass obsessively. By mid-morning, subtle changes crept into the landscape. Paths I followed disappeared into solid underbrush. Trees I passed seemed to reappear ahead of me. The forest was playing tricks or being manipulated. "They're resisting," I muttered, recalling a passage from the journal. "They can alter perception within their zone." I paused to check my compass again. The needle spun wildly for several seconds before settling back on east. I took a deep breath and pressed on. The sun climbed higher, beating down through breaks in the canopy. My water supply dwindled faster than planned as the day grew unexpectedly hot. For hours into my journey, the terrain began sloping upward toward a ridge I didn't recognize from any map. I stopped at a fallen log to rest, pulling out the journal. Flipping to the hastily drawn map inside, I found no mention of a major ridge in this area. Either I'd veered off course or the landscape itself was changing. "Trust the compass, not your eyes," I read from the journal's margins. "The terrain changes to confuse and delay." I drank sparingly from my canteen and pressed eastward, forcing myself to ignore the contradictory landmarks. The ridge that should have taken 20 minutes to climb stretched impossibly for over an hour. When I finally crested it around noon, the view ahead made me freeze. The forest below appeared distorted, as if viewed through heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Trees warped and wavered at impossible angles. The boundary described in the journal stretched across my path. A visible division between this forest and whatever lay beyond. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I'd never reached this point in previous cycles. I took up the journal again, finding the relevant passage. "The barrier causes intense disorientation, physical effects of crossing between their reality manipulation and normal space. Push through it. Don't stop, no matter what." I steeled myself and began descending toward the boundary. With each step, the distortion grew more pronounced. Colors changed unnaturally, greens too vivid, browns too deep. The air felt dense against my skin. At the edge of the distortion, I reached out a trembling hand. The space in front of me pushed back against my fingers before giving way. I stepped forward. Pain exploded behind my eyes. My inner ear rebelled, sending waves of vertigo crashing through me. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree that felt both solid and insubstantial. The forest twisted around me, reality bending in nauseating ways. I forced another step, then another. My body felt wrong, simultaneously too heavy and too light. Bile rose in my throat. "Keep moving." I crawled through gritted teeth. The boundary stretched longer than it appeared. What looked like a thin membrane from outside proved to be an agonizing half-mile of distorted space. I lost track of time as I pushed through it, focused only on placing one foot ahead of the other. When I finally emerged on the other side, I collapsed to my knees, gasping. My limbs shook uncontrollably. I vomited until nothing remained but painful dry heaves. Minutes passed before I could raise my head. The forest ahead appeared normal, strikingly so after the warped terrain behind me. Sunlight filtered naturally through branches. Paths cut clearly through underbrush, but something was still wrong. The forest stood utterly silent. No birds called, no insects buzzed, no wind rustled the leaves. The natural world had been silenced. I checked my compass again. It pointed steadily east now, with no spinning or hesitation. I rose on shaky legs and continued my journey. The afternoon stretched into a strange, silent hike through increasingly normal woodland. My map indicated the eastern highway lay approximately 7 miles beyond the barrier. At my current pace, I might reach it by early evening, well before the deadline of sunset mentioned in the journal. For hours after crossing the barrier with the sun beginning its westward descent, I paused atop a small rise to gauge my progress. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, I spotted movement. A line of green uniformed figures moved methodically through the trees. Rangers, at least 10 of them, made a search line, sweeping the forest in a coordinated pattern. They moved in perfect synchronization, each figure maintaining exact spacing from the others. I dropped to the ground. They were searching for me, creating a human net to capture me before I could reach the highway. The map showed a shallow valley ahead before the final stretch to the road. No alternate routes appeared viable. Any detour would cost precious hours I couldn't afford to lose. I had to get through their line. Staying low, I moved down the slope toward the valley floor. Thick underbrush provided cover as I advanced cautiously toward the ranger line. Their mechanical precision made their movements predictable. They maintained perfectly straight paths, never deviating to check dense undergrowth or natural hollows. I found a depression beneath fallen logs and thick ferns. If I timed it right, I could slip between two rangers as they passed. I lay flat in the hollow, controlling my breathing as the line approached. Green uniforms materialized through the trees, moving with an unnatural synchronization that sent chills down my spine. As they drew closer, I could make out their faces. All identical copies of Kevin. Blank expressions. Eyes scanning with machine-like regularity. They passed within 50 yards of my position, then 40, then 30. I pressed myself deeper into the earth, barely breathing. When they were 20 yards away, I noticed a gap in their line, slightly wider than the others. My chance. The rangers passed my position, the gap approaching. I remained frozen, waiting for the perfect moment. When the gap aligned with my hiding spot, I started to move. A fallen branch snapped beneath my boot. The rangers didn't react like humans would, with startled glances or hesitation. Instead, all heads turned simultaneously toward the sound, moving with perfect coordination. I froze again, praying my camouflage would hold. For endless seconds, the entire line stood motionless, scanning. Then, with the same synchronization, they resumed their march. Once they passed, I counted to 30 before slipping from my hiding place and moving perpendicular to their search line. My hands shook with adrenaline and relief. For the next hour, I pushed forward with renewed urgency. The rangers' presence meant I was nearing the boundary of their influence, the eastern highway that represented freedom. But it also meant they knew roughly where I was. The sun hung low in the sky when disaster struck. I rounded a thick stand of pines and nearly collided with a solitary ranger. We both froze, barely 3 feet apart. This close, the rawness of the entity was unmistakable. It wore Kevin's face, but the skin had an artificial sheen, like high-quality plastic. Its eyes tracked my movement with camera-like precision rather than human fluidity. Most disturbing was the visible seam running along the side of its neck, disappearing beneath the collar of its uniform, as if the skin had been applied over something else entirely. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other. Then I swung my rifle butt upward, catching it beneath its chin. The impact should have knocked a human unconscious. The ranger merely staggered backward, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I ran. Behind me a sound erupted that wasn't quite human, a high-pitched signal that carried through the trees. The ranger was alerting the others. I abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to buckle, but fear drove me forward. Soon I heard them behind me, synchronized footfalls gaining ground with mechanical efficiency. They didn't tire, they didn't slow, they pursued with single-minded purpose. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky orange and red. I pushed my body beyond its limits. Dehydration made my thoughts hazy. Each breath rasped painfully in my throat. I crested a final rise as darkness began to fall in earnest. There, cutting through the forest ahead, the eastern highway. A long strip of asphalt barely visible in the fading light, perhaps half a mile away. So close. I started down the slope, half running, half stumbling. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. They were gaining. As I neared the tree line bordering the highway, I spotted headlights moving along the road. Ranger vehicles patrolled its length, moving slowly in both directions. I had to time this perfectly. I reached the edge of the forest, concealing myself behind the last line of trees. The rangers behind me were close enough that I could hear their synchronized breathing. A patrol vehicle passed on the highway, then another. In the distance, a single pair of headlights approached, not the distinctive profile of a Forest Service vehicle, a civilian truck. My only chance. I summoned my last reserves of strength and burst from the tree line. My legs pumped desperately across the grassy verge separating forest from asphalt. The truck grew larger in my vision. Behind me, I heard the rangers emerge from the trees with that same perfect coordination, their footsteps accelerating to match my sprint. The truck was 50 yards away. 30, 20. I lurched into the road, directly into its path, waving my arms frantically. Brakes screeched as the driver spotted me. The vehicle skidded, tires smoking against asphalt. It stopped barely 10 feet from where I stood, swaying with exhaustion. Behind me, the rangers closed in. The driver's door opened. An elderly man with a weathered face and shock of white hair emerged, his expression changing from anger to concern. "Good Lord, son, I nearly hit you," he called out, stepping toward me. "Please," I gasped, my voice a ragged whisper. "Help me." I glanced back. The rangers had reached the edge of the road and stopped. They stood in perfect line at the forest's edge, unwilling or unable to step onto the highway. The old man looked where I was looking, but showed no reaction to the identical figures watching us. Could he even see them? "You look half dead, boy," he said, taking my arm. "Come on, get in." He helped me into the passenger seat of his battered pickup truck. My legs gave out completely as I collapsed into the seat. The journal had been right. They couldn't cross the boundary represented by the highway. As the old man climbed back into the driver's seat, I stared out the window at the rangers. They remained at the forest edge, watching with emotionless faces. "Thank you," I managed to say as the truck pulled back onto the road. "I thought I was dead." "Been lost in those woods?" the man asked, concern etching deeper lines in his already weathered face. "You're not the first. Something strange about that forest." I looked back through the rear window. In the gathering darkness, the rangers seemed to waver and distort. As we drove farther away, their figures became translucent, then faded altogether, like mirages dissolving in the night. "You have no idea," I replied. Relief flooded through me so profound it brought tears to my eyes. I'd broken the cycle, escaped their experiment. 5 times they'd reset the loop, wiped my memory, and started their cruel study. This time, I'd won. But I knew there would be others, other subjects, other experiments. The entities would continue their work, adapting their methods, refining their approach. Next time, though, there would be someone to help. A voice on the radio offering warnings and guidance. A voice that understood what was happening because it had lived through it. My voice.